Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, Ben Halpern joins us, who is the creator of Dev.to and a co-founder of Form, the platform that Dev.to is based on. Ben joins us today from New York. Ben Halpern, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Great to be here.
So as you reflect on your time in the industry, what do you believe are a few characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
I think well-maintained software needs to have, clear purpose and context that's available, as you're reading it and within the docs as needed. But the purpose should be, appropriately flexible enough to understand that, things are going to ebb and flow and that it might not be, ideally living up to its purpose. But if it's not, that's communicated either, through code or documentation. And I think that ultimately, if the software is doing what it's supposed to do, it's doing its job. But I think if it's communicating its, reason to be and where its reason might change, that's, I think, part of the journey.
Where do you find that balance of making it flexible for the unknown future? Like, how would you kind of define where you would draw that line in the sand? Because I can imagine that being different between developer to developer.
Yeah, I think ideally the organization provides enough context to allow you to draw that line in a way that maps up to what's ultimately needed. And, organization or project or whatever the context of the software is, hopefully you're not working off strictly your own tastes, because contextually, the developer's interests are important, and it's important that people, take their own pride into their work. But the collaboration between the different stakeholders and anyone who can provide enough context to say that, we are a software company and we need our software to be really flexible and reusable, or we're a furniture company and we need our software to, sell furniture, and you're probably better off not abstracting, the chair method, because all we do is chairs. That's simple enough and maybe intuitive, but I think it gets lost along the way. So appropriately, if I'm a software developer, I like writing abstractions a certain way. I want to know whether I'm, working in a situation where the chair matters or if the abstraction itself matters.
You might have chairs, sofas, whatever, and you might be like, oh, I can just go down this path of we sell items. I don't know, right? Or whatever. What would be a generic version of a chair? Someone prematurely abstract that.
Yeah, a lot of the time it is item, But I've been in situations where I've started a lot of projects. So I'm usually the one at fault for having, having sort of put it down the wrong path. But I've been in situations where, I've done the thing where everything was a little too abstract and there wasn't enough business logic, really enforced within the code. And then the next thing, I took on, I wound up being all right, not going to make that mistake again. Going to really write some stuff that is not designed to ever be extracted or added onto. This is strictly for this purpose. And then I find myself oh crap, I really should have made this more generic in the first place. And it's a dance that I find myself, making it better the next time, but in a way where I kind of feel the issue is that I'm probably mostly taking into account problems I just had and solving for those. And then, it's inherently tough to get it right.
It's true. There's that kind of maybe a little bit of overcorrecting each time. If you're in that scenario where especially if you're spinning up new projects and you're okay, what did I learn from the last time? Start trying this different approach, may go down one path. You're oh, I went too far this time. Next time I won't go that far. And then trying to find that, is it ever just right?
Yeah. And the thing about software is it's done intentionally by people, but then very quickly taken on by the group where, you've got a lot of different people with different motivations and interests and why they're even writing code in this code base in the first place. sometimes an initial choice, which was totally unintentional, just becomes the pattern. Like this is what I did without thinking about it because it didn't seem important at the time, but now it's just the pattern for the whole code base because that's just how things worked out. And it's like, so, hopefully you're intentional enough and you've seen things enough to kind of know that if you don't get this right, people are going to take it and run with it. But there's going to be a more complex version of that around every corner, the one that you don't have prior experience avoiding.
You mentioned like when it comes to like naming things, have you found that there's like a good balance also with in terms of whether or not you need a glossary to explain what certain things are in your software application, where you're like, all right, so this means this in the code base, and we've got a whole glossary over here that represents the business. I'm air quoting the business, but the other stakeholders, how they might refer to things, and trying to connect the dots as the developer. You've seen any kind of patterns emerge from that?
I really feel like the best case scenario is always when the code really expresses the name of things, but that's pretty wishful thinking. So if that's not achievable, I do think the glossary is kind of fundamentally important, because usually you get it right for a lot of stuff and then it's wrong for others. Like if something is 90% right, so you don't need a glossary because there's only a few edge cases, those edge cases will like keep biting you. Like even if they're only edge cases within like the naming convention of the code and not the actual functionality, they become things you just like keep having to correct over and over again in your dialogue. And you can't even have as functional conversations because, you named one thing, something, and another thing. And I'm saying like, what my ideal is, but I think like in our organization, like, I'm no longer strictly much of a decision maker in some of these anyway. So like if I truly, really deeply cared about something, I'd weigh in. But like but there's a few smells that I see in the code that I'm just like not day to day involved in our software development, just because I have like a different role within our organization. So like some of the things I see as smells, like they like cringe at me, but like, I'm not like a strong opinion on whether we fix them, like we'll work it out, but something I'm thinking about is we call things posts on dev and forum and the whole thing because that seems like the appropriate thing to call it. Like Instagram calls their content a post typically, and like a tweet is kind of a post, but in the code base it's called an article because that's sort of what it was originally called. And the original idea of this website was going to be much more focused on what I would think of as maybe an article in air quotes versus a blog post or even just a post. But over time, like functionally all the same elements still apply to each one. But like we've navigated towards really wanting to call it a post because we think that's more reusable. And we've made our platform, which we can get into if we want, like, more generic and reusable. And so post just seems like the perfect word for what that thing is. But in the code, it's still an article. And for a while, it was still also an article in the user interface sometimes, just because we had trouble like nailing down the glossary part, of things, and or just like committing to, some of these decisions. And it's still called an article in the code base. And I think like this is something I sort of feel like I would love if we took on the project of trying somehow, even if the database is still, the table can still be articles, but, I think it would be worthwhile to ultimately get some of this cleaned up in the code base because it's possible. It's just not like really a problem yet. So it becomes this like non-urgent thing. I think there's an ideal case, and I do think it can be a bigger deal than people want it to be.
I can appreciate that. There's usually tends to be a few things in every application that I deal with, usually that feels like it might have been named one thing because that's how people were referring it then, but people don't refer to that way anymore. Like we have a project similar in the sense that it's like a CMS type platform for one of our clients, and they always talk about their stories. They publish stories. That's not what the database calls. I think it actually is using posts, and we're like, but that's not what the client ever is going to call it. And they're like, oh, we have to add a new post, but like, so we've had to like modify a bunch of things in our application to call it a story without actually having underneath the hood like renamed it, and it does cause confusion. And on a regular basis. So feel you there on that. Very, very specific example there. It's kind of very similar.
No, I mean, we also use the term story in certain contexts where it could be posts, but we use it because technically this like area displays different types of content. So story is like even further generic than post in a lot of ways. And just because of the conventions of Rails, like there's like it's logical to maybe call it a story, to try to get things right. But it actually doesn't really trip people up. People, I think, sort of get it, but it's not like the cleanest way of organizing things. It just doesn't cause enough pain to be worth redoing, and there's, I don't know, enough built-in knowledge that that's where the thing is.
That makes sense. So we'll come back to talk about Dev and Form in just a bit. A couple of other things I'm curious about. Do you use the metaphor technical debt often in your day-to-day work, or does your team talk about it?
I think it like could be, and I think most people think about it in some term, but like it's not a keyword in the discussions I've traditionally been a part of. These days, we have a new head of engineering, Allison McMillan, on the team, and whether we use technical debt as a thing to talk about is like not something I would have a strong opinion on. So like if people have started using that as like a phrase, like in conversations I'm not a part of, I wouldn't even know necessarily for whatever reason. Like it's always been the trade-offs and these things have always been like critical to the work we do. But I don't know, for whatever reason, the phrase technical debt doesn't get as much attention like in my journey through the forum process. I think because I don't know, the project was like born out of technical debt in a lot of ways, because I was working on it like solo for so much time that it was almost like in deep technical debt in some ways, but in like somewhat like manageably overseen in a lot of other ways. Like I just don't think I mean, maybe this is somewhat common in certain circumstances, but like we've like kind of like shifted this code base so many times that certain behaviors, like they're clearly technical debt, but they've like part of the the journey in some ways. We extracted Forum out of Dev, which has been tremendous for shoring up certain parts of technical debt and also like exposing others. Almost like the capacity to fix technical debt was so much baked into the decision to make it open source and make it reusable. It just, it's like not that traditional maybe business trade-off. Like if we were selling furniture and it's like furniture sales versus the technical debt it takes to acquire, to accomplish it. Like the ultimate like journey of the code base, plays more of a leading role in our whole operation. That just trying to kind of like work through this idea of like why that word doesn't come up as much. But I think it's, like code quality versus, like making progress on Forum versus like maintaining progress on Dev and things like that. Like the decisions of this regard sometimes like flow, a little bit more naturally in some ways.
Hi there. Do you know someone who might be looking for assistance with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon would love to meet them. We're offering a $1,000 referral bonus. Send someone our way, and if they sign up for services with Planet Argon, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And in return, you'll get a check for $1,000 in the mail, just for knowing the right person. Hop on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more information and to refer someone our way. That's planetargon.com/referrals. Thanks.
So thinking a little bit more about, Dev.to, and Forum, could you provide, for those in the audience who actually aren't familiar with potentially either of them yet, they might have, I would assume that they might have stumbled across a couple of articles, stories, posts, whatever you want to call them, on a couple of, the different sites that you're helping manage. But what is Dev.to?
Dev.to is a social network community space for software developers. Almost 1 million developers are registered. We reach almost 10 million visitors a month. So like it's gotten big and important, but it's like a shared blogging space. So, and discussion, like you sign up, you create a post, people can comment, and there's a home feed, and a lot of what we do online, like as people who need to share knowledge and need to take part in a community, like need meaning like literally like software development like really fundamentally works this way. So that's what Dev is. Dev itself was kind of building off of a Twitter account, the Practical Dev, which I started before the website. So this has been like a journey of discovery and like community building, always trying to kind of reach for the next thing, but also like the next thing ends up always being just a little bit tougher and more ambitious, but very much worthwhile. So at some point in 2018, we're about a year in since we've turned Dev with my other co-founders, Jess Lee and Peter Kim Frank, into a company, not just my side project. We're making progress. We're really reaching people. We're focusing on inclusion and trying to help people just make posts more easily. And even just the simple job of like, yeah, you don't have to maintain your own blog. There's a lot of utility here. But also, we're looking at Medium, which we felt like served a lot of that utility without some of the heart and without some of the focus on what developers really need or what like a specific cohort of people really need in terms of community. So, like a lot of like insight, good ideas along the way. But in the long run, we didn't want Dev to be the kind of thing we needed to maximize as a business entirely. So, I sort of think like some of these things take a life of their own, just like the code base. Like you make one decision, it becomes a pattern, it becomes part of the code if you're not really like ready for it. I think a lot of the times companies, especially ones who have investment, like we took a seed round, we were ready to build a company that was going to employ a lot of people and be a really cool, awesome, growing thing. We didn't want the business model to be, hey, let's maximize the attention span of Dev and then sell ads or sell contact information to recruiters. A lot of stuff that might like come out as pressure if we strictly followed that model. We still monetize Dev. We think it's actually like pretty important that we have like a healthy, sustainable business model with every one of our kind of like sub businesses, because if they were purely loss leaders, I think it wouldn't necessarily like serve our economics like in a sustainable way. But yeah, we didn't want that to be the thing we maximized. But what we did see were a lot of patterns and the opportunity to do some really creative stuff with the community and to like really thrive in terms of transparency and trust building and things like that. So without thinking that we had like the perfect code base or anything, we set out to go open source because we felt like, worst case scenario, like Devs is still successful and hey, we've done this open source thing and anyone can use it. But we felt like our best case scenario is that people could use it for their independent needs. So like, Dev struggle in a lot of ways is trying to be all things to all people. And we want people to take like, hey, like, let's take the best of this code. And if you need to go deeper in something, like we just helped a website called Wasm Builders launch, and that's a WebAssembly space. Because if you're into WebAssembly, you're just not going to get everything you need out of Dev. There's a lot of like, for better or worse, we have a hard time like keeping the homepage from being just a lot of JavaScript, a lot of like really popular stuff, which is great for a lot of people, but it's like it's not great for everyone, and we want that optionality to thrive. And whether we get it right perfectly this year or next year or the year after, like there's a lot of magic in open source in terms of like, we're going to solve for some of this stuff. So we just felt like whether that succeeded or not, it was worthwhile to do. In the best case scenario, it was the healthiest thing for our community and, the internet at large, for like this to be our business model. Like we're going to let people do anything they want with forums. If it abides by our code of conduct, we'll support it. If not, it's open source and it's, like we're not going to support it, but it's like, not like, it can't exist. But But then we're going to host it. We're going to create a plugin infrastructure. We're going to, really build around this sort of stuff, and we're going to make it really awesome. And it's going to be something where we can work with big companies. Like Microsoft is one of the companies behind WebAssembly, like the Wasm community, Wasm builders. We have, like a ton of other sort of like commercial partnerships here and there. And we think our best case scenario for these is like, hey, if you want to kind of like build off of our community, if you're a software platform that's like more focused than just development as a whole, here's our code and our expertise, and we're going to help you do that. And like I mentioned, we had this idea first in 2018, so it's been a few years, slow and steady, kind of getting to that point. Maintaining dev is a core thing we do, and just working through the technical debt, but the sort of stuff that was almost just like, now it's not technical debt because now it's just like purely impeding our capacity to make forum work. So personally, I've been really excited about the opportunity to be a part of like this code project, which like is forced to be good because it's open source. It's like part of building, some more fundamental value than just like feeding dev and being this closed source thing where like, who cares if it's awful, if it's held together with Band-Aids and stuff, like it's serving some purpose. But it's just been like a fun technical journey, which has been, ambitious and challenging and ultimately pretty worthwhile. And I've learned a lot that like, I've learned so much about software, like since making the choice to go open source that like just was not in my wheelhouse before. And I'm excited to like take on at some point in the future, almost like a less ambitious project because, like it seems so easy at this point, like the simple business use case website, just like, boy, that seems like a walk in the park comparatively.
I know that we had spoken with your team a little bit before Dev.to got open sourced. Going that transition where you have a behind the scenes closed private repository project that does everything you need, and there's probably some things that you don't want to be like, it's like whether or not you're trying to just clean the code up to be in a healthy state before you show, it's kind of like opening your, inviting people into your house when you haven't cleaned it or a little bit. There's always like, oh, wait, before we open the door. It's like, what sort of things do you recall about that experience? You were like, all right, we need to think through this a little bit before we just flip the switch and like change the radio button in GitHub from public to private, like, or private to public. What sort of things did you kind of need to navigate there?
Yeah, well, for one thing, we absolutely had to be certain that like we didn't go live with our entire Git history, or if we did, it had to be cleaned up because, like this was like not even exposed to one additional person for like over a year at least. Like, so there's no way the Git history doesn't include like a lot of stuff. Like for a while, like, this is a Rails app, like the development.rb, like email password was like my password, just like my Gmail password just for testing, like, which was cleaned up before we brought, a second person in. But I'm not like 100% sure it was cleaned up like in the Git history at that point. But in knowing that, I did change my email at least, like my password. But stuff like that. Like the biggest thing was like the unknown there, and just to be like really thoughtful and careful because it really was like a project of experimentation in a lot of ways, and we really didn't want to mess up anything security wise. And a big believer in how we're able to achieve security through open source. But, the minute we go open source and we just, realize we have a JSON endpoint, which is not protected by some sort of authorization, like just being concerned that like we were at that point still just a handful of people like overseeing like a pretty sprawling Rails code base, which came about piece by piece to serve a business use case, like wasn't designed to be open source right off the bat. And yeah, we got in touch with you, we got in touch with some other people. We had a lot of people like in the dev community we, just got in touch with. And a part of this was just like the unknown unknowns, doing the same exact thing again, I feel like I'd have way, way more of a checklist. Like in hindsight, it wasn't even as difficult as we made it out to be. But yeah, I just like really didn't want to mess it up. And in the meantime, like just didn't want to do anything to take on any unnecessary risk. I mean, we've certainly like had bug bounty program and had, security vulnerabilities come up to us and stuff, but nothing ever of great severity. And, the day we went live, someone pointed out one thing and like we had to deal with it really quickly, but that was like, we were so ready, like that. We're so on top of that process, but it was also thankful in that moment that we were really, that was exactly what we were thinking about. And the thing I find in software in general with security is when you even like ask for help in this regard, everyone's going to answer with like their best practices, their checklists, their like OWASP top 10 type of suggestions and stuff. And I kept being like, look, we know all of these things. Like it's more the chaos of discovery within the code base that like we know what we need to do, but the managing the complexity of the task is really the tough part. So like a security firm coming in and, telling us these are the best practices of Rails, it's like, we really, really get that. Like we really get what a web app should have for best practices. What we're concerned about is the complexity that we're missing. Like the part of the code base that we did not effectively account for. And again, just like if going open source was part of the plan right away, it just like wouldn't be a part of the challenge necessarily. And along the way, we took security really seriously, but we were like building an application with like a lot of like consumer facing. Like we've seen a lot of Facebook leaks. Like we just didn't want any part of any of that stuff. We just didn't want to be an application that like did that stuff wrong. And I don't think like the people who expose these vulnerabilities like don't know the best practices. It's just that like, complexity is a beast.
Thinking about that type of process, you mentioned, your Git history, things that you might have done early on in the project. And so I can understand why that would be, you might be hesitant to be like, okay, I'm just going to open up the doors and hopefully nobody catches something that we didn't notice before, right? Because sometimes it's the, as you were saying, there's kind of like nuanced things that will happen. You won't know until it happens, right? Or you may, or you may never know that it happened, because not every person that's going to try to attack your platform is going to tell you about it. That's always an interesting challenge there. With the regards to open source, you have like, I think I looked on GitHub earlier, and you had maybe 600 or 700 contributors so far, I think, to the project. So when you get into that sort of scale, how do you go about like deciding if like, are most of the contributions like things like bug improvements, or are they feature enhancements, or is there kind of like any sense of like the difference there between the type of tasks, things that are actually contributing versus feature request type of thing?
Yeah. So for quite some time, we were pretty open to accepting like opportunistic feature enhancements. The challenge has always been like maintaining design and product standards, and then subsequent code standards. And that's just shifted over time, ebbs and flows as far as like, where we've been. And along the way, like recently we've sort of tightened it up, and we're just not entertaining like ad hoc feature pull requests as things, we're necessarily accepting right now. But we have a few milestones in mind, which we want to allow us to revisit this with more zeal, because in the long run, we really do want to get back to that point, but in a healthier way. Like we just sort of approached it initially in a sort of fairly unsustainable way, like almost like wisdom of the crowds kind of thing. And it was a lot of fun. It's like a lot of people who have been on the team at some point came in through open source, and then they stuck around, with our company for a while, and then they left, and they're still like around. They'll still occasionally make an issue, like it's a pretty interesting, fascinating process. And we've, been through a journey. Right now we're sort of like looking to, tighten the ship and kind of like really figure out what the long-term way of doing this is. For a while, like that notion of doing it in a very like experimental, like opportunistic kind of way was like exciting and helped us, achieve some milestones and broaden the community and things like that. But, it kind of like left things a little scattered, and we've had to kind of rein things in. And the sentiment among, like leadership in the org is that we really, really want to like get back to this in the really good, solid, permanent sort of way. And in my mind, like giving the community direction, product management, design guidelines, is a huge part of this. And how that's going to like ultimately shape up is going to be an interesting challenge. But, like we're not building like a CLI. There's no like correct interface across the board. There are a lot of API opportunities. There's a lot of underlying code. There's ample opportunity for refactoring. I would love if people could just consistently refactor our code without, like with impunity. Like I think we have a good test suite. I think there's opportunities consistently there. But getting it just right is easier said than done. And so much of it's like the journey that the company is on to kind of like be able to prioritize getting certain things just right. And, if anything, like there's a little bit too much lingering process debt for us to like be doing our ideal version of what doing this all with the community is looking like. So it's just kind of like we've had to sort of take a few things more internally than when we were for a while, where it was really sprawling. But the cool thing is like this code is never going to be closed source. This is open source forever. It's a copyleft license, like the code is open source, whether we're doing the coding or doing it with a community member. It's all out in the open for scrutiny, for like accepting issues, even just like the fact that we get to do it on GitHub, the fact that we can describe the complexity, our like account managers for people getting up and running with Forum, like they'll often like dip into like the dev channel, like our internal dev channel, and like ask for the line of code to kind of show people, like prove that this is how the app works. And, in some way, like it just kind of like, or if we're able to respond to some bug or a feature request, like sometimes we'll get a feature request come in from someone who's running Forum, like with us, like a company running Forum. It's like, it's a magical moment where it's like, wow, that's actually 1,000 times easier than anyone is realizing. And we get to fix it like immediately, like, or create that feature immediately, because it's actually just like a couple lines of code. It can be that way sometimes. And when we're able to turn that around and then show people like, hey, as soon as this gets two thumbs up in the PR review process, this is going to be, part of the code base. And that type of transparency is really enjoyable and exciting. And our best version of being this open source company, I think, is like it's ebbs and flows, but we do have almost 700 people who've contributed. It's pretty incredible, because it is not like a low barrier thing to like contribute to a real thing that 10 million people visit our one instance of this software. Like we have quite a few people starting to use it like for different purposes themselves now, and it's pretty exciting that we get to do any of it like directly with the community. And I hope we're able to sort of tighten up our processes and lean into that even more in the long run.
We'll be back with our interview with Ben in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robbie. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software Podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider sharing a link amongst your peers and or writing a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. Also, do you know someone that I should be interviewing on Maintainable? Shoot me an email to robbie@maintainable.fm. And now, let's get back to our interview with Ben Halpern. You mentioned mapping out kind of like your vision and guidelines and sharing that with the community. What has been an effective way of doing that? Or is that something you're still trying to you're evolving and experimenting with? Like, how do you disseminate that so you feel like enough of the people that are potentially contributing that may not be, employed by Forum are on the same page about that? I say that as someone that also has an open source project, and sometimes I have to remind myself, like, not everybody understands my mission or goal with this particular project. They have their own needs and they're just trying to contribute. And they're like, well, so sometimes people might ask for feature or change of something or propose something in a PR. And I'm like, well, that's kind of deviates from my vision or direction of the project, but I didn't know it until you brought it up. It's not like I couldn't direct you to some web page somewhere that says, here's my mission for Oh My Z Shell,
Yeah. I mean, part of like this challenge is that, it's inherently pretty challenging. And the tough part about the whole process has been like, this project has been like the most ambitious thing I've been a part of. So like, I'm not getting to like, swoop in with like the wisdom of everything I've accomplished to this point, so like the way we did it a year ago is so much like worse than how we do it today. But today we're facing tougher challenges than a year ago. So constantly like somewhat underqualified for the whole thing. And I think that's the tough part. Like these days describing, where things need to go and doing so, in alignment with my co-founders within the scope of my role, like very much, sure, I wrote a lot of the code early on, but like the project has gone in a very different direction in terms of like we are very much not a BDFL type of project. I am actually, most involved these days and just like helping run Dev and Code Newbie, like the communities. Not that I don't have tons of technical opinions and stuff, but really trying not to make, me the chokehold on anything. We actually have a podcast episode with our head of product and our head of engineering. I mentioned Allison. Jenny Oken is our head of product. And, she's really the one to organize and describe the product vision. And as far as like being a really effective, like super duper senior and effective product manager, she's a head of product, coming up through the product lens. And the organizational capacity, I think, we've achieved of late is kind of like providing better direction than we've had before. But, the challenge is that we had a lot of capacity to really just get things done when it was just kind of me being able to say like, that's an interesting issue. It actually coincidentally, I've really wanted to do that and it's never been worth describing because I didn't know who was going to come along and do it. And now you're here, great, let's get going on this thing. And honestly, the way we have it right now, I really foresee it being a matter of achieving organizational excellence and getting this stuff right, getting that public facing roadmap, better clarification on what's stable and what's to be done, what's the way it is because that's right. It's in a good place. Everything can stably be built on top of this. And then, what is, fundamentally still not necessarily part of the future. In terms of my own learnings and how to do this just right, it's almost less relevant than just the journey of accomplishing this as an organization in the way that's just ultimately going to result in the future that our community really needs.
That's great. Was Dev open source before it became Forum, or was that kind of around the same time?
Yeah, so Dev was open source before it became Forum. At that point, we still wanted to extract it, but we weren't there yet. Even once we got kind of there, a few people started using it before it even had the name Forum because code is code. The name's just the name. Every single key milestone along the way has been, the minimum viable milestone in some ways for us. And it's worked though. We didn't wait years to make Forum the way it is. And it's still kind of it's still in its nascence, but we also have done things gradually because Dev itself is so important to what we do and what the community needs. We have a huge priority right now to just re-emphasize the quality of Dev, where sometimes we let too many clickbait articles rise to the top and things like that. And so much of that is ultimately hey, the code kind of works. And now our focus needs to be more on just building community the best possibly way we can. And then the code's kind of on a trajectory to keep getting better and better and better forever. What we can't do is allow any part of just our community building to decay and for us not to work well with the code ourselves, yeah, like it's been sort of this journey. So like even as I say right now, like I know like our account team is currently working with like a Fortune 100 company that we're really excited about, who's looking to get up and running with Forum. But at the same time, our biggest focus is actually like as an organization, kind of shifting back to just like shoring up like some of just like the fundamentals of how we operate our own instances. And it's an interesting give and take there. So, but you were going to ask a follow up?
Yeah, it was also a little, is it a safe assumption that at some point when you were, whether when you decided to open source it or rename it or come up with a name for the product of its in and of itself and have Dev be its own instance of that, was there a conversation at all about like, should we rewrite it? And then why did you, if there was, like, how did you decide, no, that's not a good idea?
Yeah, there was like never even the question of should we rewrite it. So like part of this is because, I think like the consistency of problem solving on an ongoing basis is what's really important here. Like getting stuff like right and working on Dev and having it work in the like ecosystem of Dev, because it's not like the single user utility thing. Like the notion of correctness and functionality is one of pure chaos, because it's this nhưng, and if anything, we're far enough along now that the question of like rewriting it almost could make more sense. But we've rewritten big chunks of it along the way, obviously. And I also think like if we rewrote it for technical reasons, it might be to rewrite it in a less memory and resource intensive environment, because ultimately in the long run, we really badly want it to just run more cheaply than like, a big bulky Rails app can be at times. We're accomplishing some of those goals right now through like a lot of hardcore systems work. So like Forum Cloud like is pretty well optimized and things like that. But it's a nice like idea to have this be, a Rails app. But then ultimately, I think if we rewrite parts of it over time as things become more stable, hypothetically, I think it'd be really cool for it to be much of the code to be rewritten and the core functionality to be so much more about the data layer. Like, Postgres is, I think, like the one like true enabling technology for all of this. And like, unless somebody comes by with a new, better database, like that seems like the thing we're going to want to ride with forever. My most exciting version of the future of the code base is that like, hey, maybe like every bit of the code ultimately is rewritten in like in a different environment, such that the whole thing is, could be packaged up in like an executable, just like some other situation. Rails is kind of funny, but we're also like most likely we're just going to try to be a clean, tight, concise like Rails application forever. And it's unlikely that we'll ever have enough breathing room to want to, take on a true like all-in rewrite.
Makes sense. Is Forum hiring at the moment?
Yeah, jobs.forum.com. I believe we're currently hiring for a principal engineer role, and folks who are listening should keep up with what we're up to. Like we're not hiring at a frenetic pace right now, but like that could change. Like one of these big companies latches on with Forum, it gives us like a lot of reason to like speed up some of our development opportunities and stuff. But yeah, I think we're hiring for like at least one position right now, and we're trying to build a really cool, technically driven company. So like if you apply now and you don't get it, like I really think like we're gonna keep having job openings and really have a good future ahead of us as a software company.
That's great. I'll definitely include links to your job site in the show notes for everybody. A couple of quick last questions for you, Ben. Is there a non-software book that you find yourself recommending to peers on a regular basis?
One book I find myself recommending surprisingly often is a book called Creative Quest. It's written by Questlove, the artist, musician, and I find the topic of creativity to be one that is like often like written in a way that like sucks the creativity out of the whole idea. And this book, I think like doesn't do it. I think it's like written in a way that like lives up to the material. Questlove is like a deeply creative person, but is like very self-aware throughout the book of like feeling like, his definition of creativity is his own and stuff. I read the book. I also listened to the audiobook because I just felt like it was narrated by him, and I felt like listening to that too. And I think it's a really fun listen as well. Where he like interjects and like goes off script a couple times in a way that doesn't interrupt the book, in a bad way. So it's not like I just recommended a fiction book. Like I think this book is borderline, solid professional development type material, but also like, really fun and not going to feel like, a book about productivity habits and stuff like that.
No, I appreciate that. I hadn't heard of that one before, so I'm going to check that out myself. And so where can listeners best follow your ruminations and thoughts about software development online?
Yeah, so dev.to/Ben is, where I'll typically publish for the most part. I'm Ben D. Halpern on Twitter. And, otherwise, like, I try to take the Ben username across the forum ecosystem. So, we're not trying to be the one place to achieve these things, on just dev. So I think you're going to find me around in different places. But then also just like, as I've mentioned, like my role in our company, has shifted. Like I'm still around, but we're not trying to be like a BDFL kind of company or project or anything like that. So I'm looking forward to like finding some time to kind of get back to writing about any topic of software that's like not entrenched in like our code base or this journey in particular and stuff. Like as entrenched as I still am in the journey, I think like some of my writing, I anticipate exploring like, other, code topics.
That sounds great. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Ben. Thanks so much for talking shop.
Yeah, thanks for having me.